So I just need to remind Damien about, I saw your email about reporting the...
I mean, it's not to be... normally it's still
Warm.
just in case somebody...
Hi. Hello. How are you?
Good.
Thank you
So air conditioning, it's quite a warm room.
Yeah. Oh, my pleasure.
It's a balance between opening the window and getting all the
some
noise.
of the community decided they wanted
We
to
can-
walk
if we-
from
That's the air
Dundee
conditioning.
so as long as they get here in
Well,
time.
that won't
That's
take
lovely.
long at all.
Good.
Yeah, I walked
Good.
here as well. Yeah, I just thought I'd
I mean, if
have
it
a
gets
look
some there,
and
we
get
can
some
do our
Yeah, no,
windows open.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Understandably.
Did you go and see the games show?
Yes, well,
Yeah, or
so
did
we
you guys already
actually
see it in London?
saw it in London.
Yeah, that's fine.
And it was,
It's really good. Yeah.
but we were visiting V&A Dundee partly just to see the museum.
Wonderful.
But they took us through
Oh,
again to kind of
yeah.
just show the little things they've done.
Yes. Yeah, I heard some things are fabulous.
Great.
It is. It's definitely. I think it does a really good job of showing all that it can be and that there is.
And
Yeah.
capturing the kind of excitement and vibrancy
Yes.
of the industry.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I loved it.
Yeah.
But it's such a beautiful space inside.
It is,
Just
yeah.
the way the water reflects off
Yeah.
the surfaces.
Yes, and I love
stunning.
the building outside. I walk through it every day.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, it's
What,
all
just to
my-
kind of
Because I live over in City Key, and well, you know where I work.
Yeah.
and that's actually, I walk along the water and through the V&A up to my office. Well,
That's
the
brilliant.
office. Oh, it's amazing. It's such a great commute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's members were very impressed.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Glad that we got to go there.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. Can I get you anything? You all right?
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, thank you.
excellent. So yeah, we should kick off at 11:50.
Sounds good.
Committee just need to meet in private for a little bit.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Sounds good. Yeah.
Cool. This is wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah. Cool. So some of the members of the walk to V&A. So we'll just wait for them. Yeah.
Good morning. If I could sort of formally call the committee to order and welcome you to this meeting this morning of the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee as part of our inquiry into immersive and addictive technologies. And we're delighted to be here in Dundee today at the University of Abertay, and we're very pleased that Abertay University has been able to host the evidence session here this morning and also host the visit of the committee yesterday. And we're delighted to welcome our panellists as well to the evidence session. Colin Anderson, Keely Bunting, you both represent games companies that are based in Dundee. To me, I believe you're a graduate of Abertay University. Not interesting Tony's views on this as well, but perhaps you could each give us some insight into why you think Dundee has developed as an important cluster within the game sector and what's made it a place that's attracted people to come and work and to come and study. Perhaps, Colin, if you could start, and then we'll work along the panel.
So I think this is something I can speak to directly because I know what brought me to Dundee, and I'm sure it's the same for a lot of other people, which is it was the projects that were here. Like when I got involved in the games industry, there was nowhere else in Scotland that you could work in the games industry. The whole of the games industry was right here. And Lemmings was a huge success, as I'm sure you'll have been hearing during your visit. And the money that created from that, just the commercial success from it, really did help to drive all sorts of innovation and also to bring people to the city. So I think that's really the key thing that's been a constant in everything that I've seen throughout my career in the games industry, which is in the games industry, projects act as talent magnets for companies and for cities alike. So when you have a successful project, you generally have a successful business, and when you have a successful business, that brings in talent from all over. I think you can see that if you look at the geography of the games companies around the country. If you look at where there are clusters, you will generally find that at some point in the past there was a successful game developed by a company in that area. So Guildford, for example, was Bullfrog with Populous, and obviously Sagnosis based in Liverpool with their portfolio as well. So yeah, you can see now what we see is the legacy of that, and Dundee is certainly part of that.
So for myself, I moved here about a year and a half ago from London, and I hate to admit, but before I had been contacted by a recruiter, I hadn't heard about Dundee. But then when I looked into it, I was actually really amazed and really impressed. There's a variety of games companies here, which is really fantastic. And there's also 2 really strong universities that have games-related programs. You have Abertay, which has a lot of game design, and you have DJCAD, which is part of the University of Dundee, which has a strong arts program. And I think it's particularly attractive to games people because of the fact that this is a very creative city. When you go around, you'll see a lot of great sculptures. You'll see people with every color hair that you can imagine. There's lovely museums and galleries. They have Pechakucha nights here. There's also great street art. Also, as an employee, there's a very good cost of living. You can find nice places to live here. There's also great infrastructure. They have transit, grocery stores, nice restaurants. There's also lovely leisure, the Olympia, which is the big pool. I'm on a swim team there. It's fantastic. You can also go golfing. It's lovely that way. The waterfront, I think, is very attractive. And also you have larger cities within reach, so you can have the best of both worlds. And so it's great because it's a hub where you basically have a sharing of ideas and people can come together and discuss best practices.
For me, it was Abertay. I knew from a young age that I wanted to make games, and when I was researching, ways to get into the industry and what to study, I kept coming across Abertay, and I'm originally from Hungary, and it actually drew me across borders to come here because it appeared to me that it's the best quality education I can get, and all the industry contacts that the university had, and all the projects, collaborations, the fact that we have all the various disciplines represented here in courses, and collaboration is very much in the DNA of every single course, and all the disciplines are encouraged to cross over was a major draw for me, and it felt like a great opportunity for me to learn and study and get to know the people from the get-go. So it was Abertay for me, absolutely.
Thank you. I mean, Tony, you work in Edinburgh. I mean, to what extent do you think the games companies in Edinburgh have a sort of connection or common interest with the games companies in Dundee? Do you think people see it as a common cluster? And do you think games companies in Edinburgh see Dundee as a place to recruit from as well?
Yeah, so I think like Scotland as a whole just has like quite a strong kind of sort of family kind of vibe around the development scene. I mean, so obviously, yeah, like Abertay was, I think, the first university in the UK to have a games-specific course. So that's, as Colin mentioned, that's kind of why the area around here like grew up really quickly and like really advanced quite quickly. But as companies have kind of spread out into like the other kind of central belt cities, and even like further north, there's like companies like Hunted Cow and stuff further up the country. I think everyone kind of in the region in general kind of works together, and not necessarily kind of just looking at recruiting from here, but it's attractive to potential employees to come to the country because there are other companies here. So you wouldn't move to Dundee if there was only one company in Dundee that you could get a job at, but that there's a wide range of companies within an hour's travel from here, I think does make it very, very attractive.
How important do you think the role of the university is to supporting the games industry in not just Dundee but in Scotland as well? I mean, we've met over the last day or so, people who've rather like you, Tamir, who are graduates of this university and who've gone to work directly in the games industry. You know, is that relationship between the companies and the university important, do you think?
I'd say that it's very important. For example, at Outplay, 25% of our staff are right out of university, and a lot of them are from Abertay. We actually work actively to mentor at Abertay and to make sure that we're available to offer speakers and do studio tours and work experience, and we also hire students part-time as staff, and we also hire new grads.
I would echo that. I think the relationships between the universities and the companies in Dundee is incredibly important. And it goes as far back as even before Abertay. So DJ CAD at Duncan Georgeson College of Art and Design, they were a big supplier of talent into DMA in the early days of the games industry. So as far back as that has been absolutely critical to the development of the sector in this area. And then laterally, obviously since Abertay started, really pioneered the undergraduate degree for video games. That was a huge bonus for the area that's just snowballed over time, and to see the level of quality that has continued to come out of that course has been really inspirational for me, actually, because I remember the first few years where there was a lot of skepticism, and it was a really there was a lot of skeptics around when that started back in the late 90s. But to see it actually not only deliver but become a world-class institution off the back of that reputation has been amazing. It's also helped to see the industry through some difficult times in Dundee, because periodically you have disruption in the market, and you see that various businesses will grow up and then scale back, and new businesses will grow up from that. So during those difficult transition periods, we've seen that the universities have acted as a kind of cement for the industry in this area.
What I'd like to add to that, if that's okay, is having universities of such high quality in the country, I think, is amazing for companies, because it's not a one-way street. Like obviously it's a fantastic thing to have sort of like a constant talent pool. The industry is obviously very international, and most companies would hire internationally, and there's plenty of momentum moving across borders. But to have a well-known institution that is high quality so close by also allows companies to feed back information, and if so there is a skill or a particular area that they feel is lacking, they can actually feed that right back into the universities and sort of have a two-way dialogue where they can sort of encourage students to to fill some of those gaps, or to pass on the information that maybe the universities weren't aware of, but it's important to industry. So it's to have it so close by, and to be able to maintain this dialogue that actually kind of encourages the talent pool to fit exactly the requirements that are present in the industry is, I think, crucial to the success of the industry.
Ian Lucas.
Just actually briefly picking up on exactly that point, I was going to ask if clearly we've got a very successful relationship with the university here. So do you directly input into the courses themselves? And how does the relationship actually work? Are there committees working together, or how does that work?
So the short answer to that would be yes. I've personally been involved in various course assessments, revising the actual coursework, looking at what is being done, making sure that it fits with what the industry needs. And that's happened several times over the years. One of the most successful courses to come out of Abertay in recent years is the MProf, which is a practically focused course that focuses around the delivery of a practical project in teams. And that was feedback that came directly from myself and many others in the industry, who were talking about the importance of the dynamic within teams and how important it is for students to have that experience during their education, so that when they come into the industry, they already have an understanding of the social dynamics and appropriate behaviours and so on, that very often until that point was actually being left until people entered the industry before it was being offered. So yeah, it's very much a two-way thing, and all the universities around this area actually are constantly reaching out for as much input from industry as possible.
Thank you. The video games industry in the UK as a whole seems to be performing very strongly. And some people have said that the production tax credit has been a big contributing factor to that. But it'd be interesting in your perspectives whether you think that has been a big factor, or whether there are other forces at play which have underpinned the success of the sector in the recent years. Colin, you want to start here?
Well, yeah, I think it's kind of hard to overstate how important the production tax credits have been over the last, 4 or 5 years that they've been in place. I forget when they came in. I've been involved in doing it as part of TIGA and lobbying for it. That it feels like forever, but I know it's only been a few years it's been in actual operation. But already, we've seen TIGA and UK both report the influence that's having on the scale of the industry in the UK, but moreover, my own personal experience of that. So Earthbound Games is a company that was set up in 2017 here in Dundee, and the production tax credit has been a key component of bringing investment into that business. So I can tell you just from the conversations that I have on a day-to-day basis just how important that is in providing an appetite for investment in this sector.
So my own company and workshop, we are 4 years old now, very kind of small scale company still, but we've used the video games tax relief. We've had SEIS investment has been really useful for us kind of in those early days of kind of getting started, and also the UK Games Fund. We've received funding for one of our projects through that, and that's also been really useful as well. So I think that because there are these a few different kind of schemes and a few different ways that fledgling companies can kind of find ways to kind of maximise their ability to raise investment, it is really, really useful for just kind of keeping you going, because obviously the games industry, like a game could take 6 months to 2 years or something like that to come out. So you need to get that, to be able to have that kind of revenue, like the income before you're actually generating revenue off of one of your titles, is super, super useful.
So I'm a designer. I'm not on the finance team, but I am aware that we have made use of the video game tax relief in the past, and I've been told that that's very valuable and positive for the projects that we work on, particularly developing new games.
Thank you. I mean, overall, do you, as well, just looking at the sort of future direction of the games industry, I mean, you're all from different sorts of companies that make different sorts of games, but how important do you think the free-to-play model has become for the game sector, and in particular, free-to-play games that you can also play through mobile as well as from a PC?
So I think that the free-to-play model is particularly interesting to both consumers and to companies. In general, this is associated with games as a service, and so as opposed to a game that you release and then that's that, we are creating games that are able to be played for a long period of time with additional content and additional features being added over time. And this allows us as a company to have a long-term relationship with our players and to be able to be agile and to respond to their interests. As a consumer, it allows you to try a game and decide if it's something that's of interest to you and whether or not you want to invest your time in it, and in some cases, whether or not you want to invest money. I think it's very valuable because people don't necessarily want to just pay for something and then see whether or not they like it. They like to be able to try it first.
The free-to-play market has been hugely influential particularly in the mobile space. And I remember prior to free-to-play becoming popular in the UK and in US, it was quite a different operation. So mobile, for example, most people think of mobile phone games starting with the iPhone in 2007, 2008. But there was actually quite a substantial mobile phone market prior to that in the early 2000s. And the consumer experience for that was less than stellar, I think it would be fair to say. And it put all the risk essentially onto the customer in order to buy the game before they could even find out if they liked what they were going to play. So following up on Keely's point, I know as a game player myself, I don't like that. I like to be able to try something at low risk, see what I like, and then make a decision on whether to invest my time and money in that. So the free-to-play market has definitely made a big change in consumer behaviour, but it's also bled into all sorts of areas in the commercial model of it as well. So how you finance games, how you design games, how you monetize games, all of these things have been directly affected by that. We've seen it in the mobile space predominantly so far, but we're also, as some of you who visited Earthbound Games yesterday will have seen, I was suggesting that is now starting to happen in PC as well, and I'm sure console over time. So yeah, free-to-play is definitely where the market is trending towards.
I think it might also be interesting to note that free-to-play games actually came as a response to issues regarding piracy. When it was first brought out in Asia, it was because a lot of games companies were having the products they were creating, they were being stolen. And by offering a service that you then have a server in the back and a client in the front, there's a communication and you're able to check that whoever's participating is supposed to be there and that what they're doing is what they're supposed to be doing.
And furthermore, not just, I mean, that's absolutely right, but not just from a piracy point of view, but also from a player's point of view. There's all sorts of hacks and cheats that people will do in order to get benefits for themselves in games, which can be eradicated by having some sort of server-side system. And that obviously, again, lends itself towards the free-to-play model. So there's a huge lot of consumer benefits as well as design benefits.
From a business point of view, do you think you make more money per player from a free-to-play model where players are then purchasing sort of in-game add-ons, sort of cosmetic add-ons to their in-game experience, than there is that you make more money doing that than you do from just selling games to people?
I think the actual figures, I'm not an expert on the figures, I'm not academic, and I'm certainly not up to date on what the latest figures suggest, but anecdotally, yes, you can see that the top monetizing games in the world right now are broadly free-to-play games, and the reason for that is not hard to understand, that there is no upper limit to what you can purchase. So you're essentially enabling people to spend what they like. You're taking the cap off. Whereas on a premium title where there's a fixed price, once that price has been paid, it's then there's little or no additional revenue. We're starting to see hybrid models now where there's a premium purchase and some sort of in-game monetization as well. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of additional experimentation around that model over time. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a trend towards higher monetization in free-to-play models.
Keely, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I think that when you have games as a service, a lot of it will depend on how long you have the player with you and the percentage of players that choose to monetize. So, for example, in the games that I work on, we actually have less than 5% of our user base who choose to make purchases, and even within them, over the course of a month, that and this is actually quite standard for the casual game genre, but it may be less than $1 over the course of a month on average for players. So it's depending on how long somebody plays your game for. The game that I work on has been live for almost 4 years. Over the course of 4 years, that may result in a particular figure. But if someone comes in and plays it for a few weeks, then they move on to something else.
Just a couple of follow-up questions from me before I bring in other members of the committee. Keely, that figure you quoted of an average of $1 a month sort of in-game purchase, is that for all users, all players?
Yes, it is.
So if you were in the 5% category who play frequently, what on average would they spend, do you think?
So I don't have that figure with me, but I'd be happy to request that for you.
We'll be very grateful for that.
Okay.
But do you, in general, I mean, just off the top of your head, if you were to, as a businesswoman, if you were thinking about what would a reasonable rate of return be like for a game, where for the players that are heavily engaged in the game and are playing frequently, what do you think would be a reasonable expectation of what they might spend a month?
I don't think I can say. I'm not in finance. Sorry.
I mean, Colin, do you have a view on that in terms of, from your business point of view, in terms of developing a game where you're looking for, you're making the investment in developing the game, you're looking to make your money down the line for in-game purchases. What do you think is a kind of reasonable expectation of what average amount of spend should be from a player who's playing the game frequently?
That's incredibly difficult to answer, and I'm not just trying to be evasive. It varies so much between titles. It's a bespoke number that you will get depending on what genre you're in, what your user base is, what your average demographic is, all sorts of things. So trying to pin it down to what a reasonable return rate is, you'd be better looking at it in a totally abstract way of saying, well, as a commercial business, if your expenses in order to create is this, what is a reasonable rate of return? Now, that's not something that we have as an industry legislated, for example, so it's something that varies enormously across the businesses. So many businesses, I know, struggle to get above the cost that they're trying to produce at, whereas other businesses are far in excess of that. So if you look at some of the Fortnite numbers that are public at the moment, you can see, going back to that number that you were asking Keely for, again, don't quote me on this because I've got it on my top of my head, but I don't know if it's correct, but I seem to recall that for all players it was somewhere around $50, and for paying players it was somewhere around $85. So that gives you some indication, and apologies to Fortnite if that's completely wrong.
So those things, 50, over what period of time?
I couldn't say.
Sorry, so $50 what, a year, or $50 a...
As I say, I couldn't say. It was quoted in an article that I read. I'm not entirely sure what the time period was they were using.
Okay, we'll see if we can find that article. Brendan O'Hara.
Over the past couple of days, we've heard how the industry in Dundee and Furtherfield is buoyant and been hugely successful, and we've seen an awful lot of evidence for ourselves to support that. I'd be interested to know, though, what are the issues, or what do you consider the issues to be, particularly those out with the control of the industry, that could possibly threaten that success? I mean, is it completely, is the garden completely rosy? There's no clouds in the horizon that you can see?
I would say there's numerous things that could affect that. So over the last 10 years or so, for example, one of the things that we did see is highly competitive strategies on digital media being implemented by other countries. So we know that the tax breaks that we now have in place within the UK were largely as a result of other territories offering incentives to bring the industry to them. So I remember in particular, would it be the late 90s or the early 2000s, we had a substantial number of people leave our industry in the UK to go to Canada and set up there because there were numerous incentives for developers and publishers to set up there. So that's definitely one example that we have to be constantly aware of. Is the UK is an incredibly successful country in terms of its games industry, but that's not something that it inherently deserves. It's something that is coveted by everywhere else in the world and is constantly being challenged. So periodically we come up against situations where somebody finds a really good way of usurping us, and that was one example.
I mean, I think as well there are obviously wider political issues that are ongoing at the moment. Because like storefronts pretty much are all, like the companies that run these storefronts pretty much all dealing in dollars. So, for example, anything that affects the currency conversion amounts can have a tremendous sort of swaying value one way or another on your income. And I know certainly like this for our company, our current title is being published by a German company, so we have very close ties there, and there's kind of, in terms of like tax situations and stuff like that, if things get tricky, I could see that kind of impacting our income as well. And I think there's obviously, in terms of recruiting, there's like a lot of native talent, but I mean, as you've heard from the people here, that there's plenty of people would come to the UK because people want to work in the UK games industry. So obviously, things which kind of affect that freedom of movement are potentially throwing a spanner in the works in terms of recruitment as well.
Picking up on that point, so currently, how easy is it to find the people with the skills that you need to develop your games and to grow your business, as we currently stand?
So as I say, my company is very small. We're kind of not really taking on sort of full-time staff right now, but we do use a lot of freelancers, which because of the kind of nature of the industry, it's actually quite easy for us to work with people remotely. So all of our staff kind of work spread around the country and stuff. In which case, like, that's for companies of our kind of scale. Like, I've not found it particularly difficult to find the people that we need to fill roles. But I'm not sure if people have been hiring for larger companies.
I think generally speaking, it will depend on your company, like Tony said. So depends on how people perceive your company, the size of your company, the types of projects that you're working on. Generally speaking, I think one of the big issues that the industry is facing is a general question of diversity, and a lot of factors come into that, including hiring from overseas, including the talent pipeline coming through universities, people moving laterally from other jobs into the tech industry and into games, because there are plenty of transferable skills across other technology and creative industries, and obviously wider diversity in recruitment and encouraging everyone to feel like this is an industry that's welcoming to them and they can express their opinions. So all of those are factors that are somewhat influenceable by the industry, and I think the industry is trying to do things to tackle them, but it's obviously not an industry-only problem, and it is a problem that is present in the wider society as well, and so it's somewhat outwith of our control as well. But it's not a simple question of saying, okay, this is one problem that we can solve with X or Y solution, and there are so many factors into it, as I said, all the way from sort of childhood and the talent pipeline and retention and everything, that it's going to take collaboration both within and outwith of the industry to solve it, and it's something that hopefully we're working towards.
And so, looking ahead, do all of you feel that enough is being done to develop people with the right skills that you will need in the future?
I think one of the challenges that this industry has is that we're not entirely aware of all the skills we actually need in order to be able to manufacture games effectively and efficiently. And that's not a deficiency of of any particular university or the industry or academia, government or whatever. It is literally a case of we are forging ahead in an entirely new media here. And many of the skills that we now take sort of for granted throughout many of the industries that we have. So coders, for example. There was a time when if you were a coder, you either worked in a bank and a database, or you were doing really low-level hardware tech, or you worked in the games industry. So there weren't that many industries that were utilizing them. But now, as some of the other panelists have touched on, digital is touching every area of society, and so the increase in demand for those kind of skills is rising. So that causes one issue, but the actual how you make creative teams work together in ways that don't result in just unpleasant work environments for people. So the kind of production level, the commercial level, business models, all of the innovation around those are areas where there's still quite a lot of innovation required in those areas before we even know the kind of skills that will be required in order to get that working for the future. Now, the good news is Abertay has just recently, as part of a conglomerate with St Andrews and Dundee, pitched successfully for the in-game programme, which is going to be looking at those kind of areas and actually championing research in those areas, and that's a fantastic thing to say. So I'm particularly hopeful that we'll see some progress in those areas over the next, 3 to 5 years. But yeah, it's not quite as simple as just turning on a tap and saying, well, we need more programmers, we need more artists. It's like, yes, we do need programmers, and Abertay has been very successful in helping fulfill that, same with artists and so on as well. But when it comes to the kind of business level and the operational level and all the infrastructure around that, there's still a lot of work to be done.
So you need to be, from what you're saying, pretty fleet of foot and be able to recruit the best people you need as quickly as possible. So how important then is access to overseas talent for your businesses? And following on from that, what effect will Brexit have on your ability to recruit and therefore on your ability to proceed as you would hope?
I think it's very important to be able to recruit as diversely as possible, and that very much includes overseas. We're a creative industry, we're a creative medium. I don't think it's as simple as having good programmers and good artists and whatever. We're creating stories. We're, very much playing part of culture and creating and reflecting culture. So having different backgrounds and having different perspectives brought into that is absolutely crucial to the success of the industry and, the way we represent and feed into culture. And anything that has the effect of homogenizing our talent pool is going to hurt that. So I think it's very important to allow all our avenues to be, open and be able to hire as diversely as possible.
So just to give a sense, currently the staff at Outplay, it's 71% people from the UK and approximately 22% staff from the EU and 7% elsewhere. So I think that gives a sense of the fact that, we do have people coming from all over and that's of value to us.
Yeah, similarly, the overseas talent is incredibly important for the industry in general, and particularly for Earthbound, and any barriers between us being able to bring people in quickly and effectively would be a hindrance to that. I think, I would really just echo the points that have already been made. We already have some disturbance, obviously, around that at the moment, and there's a lot of people with uncertainty. In terms of what difference it will make, I'm not sure we could comment on that because we don't know what the terms of our future relationships would be. So until we know that, it would be harder to say, but I'm guessing it wouldn't be helpful.
Just finally, are any of your companies doing any post-Brexit preparedness?
At the moment, we've taken the basic precautions that we can. There's recommendations that have been put around by the trade industries that we are obviously taking heed of. But in terms of actually being able to address the concerns of staff who we have, who want to know what their situation is going to be post-Brexit, then no, we've not been able to do that, obviously, because we were waiting to find out what's going to be happening.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same situation of when I talked to my accountants about it. They said, we can't really give you any advice because we don't know how the cards are going to fall on the table. So as soon as there's a definitive thing of, okay, this is what is going to happen, we can give you advice and we can work on that. But until then, it's all a little bit up in the air.
Joe Stevens.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just pick up on that point that you've just been talking about after Brendan's question? So at the moment, there are proposals from the government about a new immigration regime where the minimum income level, annual income level, would be £30,000 a year to be able to come into the UK to work. So Tony, Keely, Colin and Timio, would that cause you a problem in terms of recruiting people?
Well, as I said, for our company, we're kind of not really looking at taking on full-time staff at the moment. Like, we just use freelancers right now.
Mm-hmm.
Would
it apply to people who are already in the UK and their ability to stay, or is it purely to bring people into the UK?
It's not definite at the moment. So on the assumption that it's people who are here currently, as well as people who would want to come in the future.
Yeah, so I've certainly had problems in the past with staff who were on lower salaries, but performing what are integral parts of the operation. And generally, it's the people who are in the operational part. So it's the people who are running the office. It's people who are running the infrastructure around game development. Those salaries can be below those thresholds that have been set, and that can certainly cause issues. But it's one of those things where you really have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Of course, it will cause some issues. What those issues will be, it's hard to predict. But some people will obviously benefit from it. Some people won't. It's a political decision that has to be taken, and we have to run with whatever is decided. And obviously, we would do that. But given the choice, we would like to be able to choose from the widest talent pool with the least friction possible, which is what we believe we have right now.
And just in terms of like the sort of, obviously with us being sat in Aberdeen right now, I think obviously graduate jobs are some of the lowest paying, so you would find potentially that it would make somewhere like Aberdeen less attractive to foreign students, because if you leave the university and you can't get a job in a Dundee company because you're not allowed to stay because you're not earning enough, I think that would really actually impact the attractiveness of like a lot of the educational establishments in the country.
So within a game studio, you have a variety of different departments and a variety of people of different seniority, so there's going to be a wide range of salaries. There's also the fact that people who live in a city with a high cost of living are going to be paid more than people who are in a smaller city with a lower cost of living. And so that could have a potential to be more hurtful for studios that are in smaller cities with lower costs of living.
Also, the games industry is very dynamic, and there's lots of, new companies, student upstarts, all that sort of thing, and to have that sort of, requirement universally applied would, I think, very much put a stress on any of this new upstarts and prevent innovation, and I think have a negative impact across the board, because of this uncertainty that we've been talking about. Companies might decide that they're just, hire from talent pools that they know that they can rely on, and even though they might realize that it's going to hurt their creativity in the long term and their business because of the same reason, the uncertainty just makes it incredibly hard to navigate it, both from an employee and an employer point of view.
I wanted to move on to diversity. So the 2 days we've been here, we've met fantastic people in companies, in the university here. And I'm not being rude, but most of them are young white men with beards. So this panel, our expert panel here today looks very different. But I'm really struck by the very few number of women who are involved, from what I've seen so far, in the industry. So why is that such a problem? Timia.
Well, it's a big question. I think there's a lot of historical reasons behind it, just from where the games industry kind of, evolved from, especially in the sort of 80s and 90s. There was a fairly conscious at the time marketing decision to start targeting video games towards boys, towards, young guys, young men, and that had a profound impact on the types of games that were developed, the types of talent that was sort of allowed at the table to make the decisions for the types of stories that games tell, and it just had a whole knock-on impact on where the games industry is right now. Historically, women have been fundamental in computer science, and yet we, now live in a time where women are like massively underrepresented in most computer science courses, most technology courses, and jobs as well. I think it's something that the games industry is actually very aware of. I think it's a problem that exists in most industries, in some one way or another. Definitely across creative industries, it's not a games industry only problem, but I do believe that the games industry is more aware, maybe than some other industries, because of things that happened in the past, I think. And awareness is always the first step in correcting a problem, so I think that's a good sign, but there needs to be more that's done to actually close the gap and to actually encourage more women to think of video games as a viable career, to choose it, and then to stay in it and advance to senior positions. Because I think we are maybe making some progress in encouraging young women to be interested in STEM careers and join the games industry, but there's still a big gap when it comes to senior levels and management levels between men and women. And that's something that companies themselves need to look into more and investigate more, how they can fix structural problems that might lead to that, but it's also something that can come out of the games industry. I think generally there needs to be a better understanding and appreciation of games as a cultural medium from wider society, because at the moment I feel like there are still plenty of decision makers and influencers in young people's lives in general who don't think of video games as a real job or something that is a viable career. And so even if someone's passionate about it and would make a great game developer, they might drop out before that's even on the cards, because their guidance teacher or parent didn't fully understand the industry, and therefore they were discouraged from pursuing that as a career. So there's definitely a pipeline element to it, on which the games industry, universities, but the wider community has to collaborate in order to fix. And then there's the other massive point of retention and training women to be able to advance in those careers and to want to stay in it. So it's massively multifaceted, and it's something that I think a lot of people want to solve, and it's currently, lots of people are kind of trying to, brainstorm ideas to fix it. There is not currently a solution, but I'm hopeful that that's something we can work towards.
Okay, Keely, what's your view?
So the reason it's a problem is because it is a cultural medium. You wouldn't want all of your books, you wouldn't want all of your music, you wouldn't want all of your movies to be made by a homogenous group. Video games are really important as entertainment and as something that speaks to society and informs society. And so it's important that the authorship be inclusive of people from a variety of backgrounds. I think that a lot of the things that Tamia mentioned are valid. I think that as far as education goes, it's really important that before students start selecting electives, they are informed of all their career options, particularly non-traditional options. Not only would I like to see more women in technology, I would love to see more men in nursing. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's also important that when we look at how many women are in games, we don't just look at it as a whole, but we also ask questions about what kinds of roles, what level of seniority, and who the vision holders are. Because, if you think about it as the film industry, if everybody was in catering, that's not necessarily the same level of influence as the director.
Yeah. Leading on from that, is it the same in other countries? The stark difference. Do you find that is similar in other countries? And are there other industry sectors which have managed to make a change that you've seen that you might look at to learn lessons from, or to improve the diversity levels, assuming that it is everybody's wish that you want to do that?
I think it is the same in most countries. Obviously I don't have the stats, I can't speak to every single country, but it seems like a generally global statistic. I'm personally not aware of any sort of example cases where an industry managed to kind of switch out of that, one way or another. But I think that's obviously you kind of have to take everything with a pinch of salt, just because the games industry is going to have its own unique problems and hopefully unique solutions as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Colin?
Just on Timmy's point there about not being aware of an industry that's managed to change it, the only one that I can think of was there is an example of hiring musicians into an orchestra. I can't remember which one it was. I think it was one of the US orchestras. Again, I'm sure if you Google it, you'll find it. But they had obviously a very small number of female musicians in the orchestra, and they were trying to address that. And they went through a process whereby the selection criteria that they used was much more transparent. And as a result of that, I do believe they managed to move in the right direction. I'm not sure if it's wholly representative yet, but it was certainly, I think everyone saw the benefit of it.
I was very struck by what you said earlier about practical teaching around collaboration, team working, acceptable behaviours, that sort of thing. So there's lots and lots of evidence that shows that more diverse teams make better decisions and produce better products. Is that something that you think could be used as part of this drive for more diversity, so that you have that succession pipeline feeding through from universities into your companies?
I certainly think it wouldn't hurt.
Right.
One of the issues we have is that, particularly in certain niches within the industry, it can be a very highly pressured environment. And in those circumstances, I think there are many people, not just women, but I suspect many people who just look at the environment and just think, I do not want to be part of that. and there are other options that they would rather pursue. Personally, I would like to see us as an industry move towards a much more structured system, a much more well understood process of making games that allow us to mitigate against these high work periods where we end up with projects slipping and all that sort of thing, that lead to difficult personal situations. So you can end up with situations where people can't take holidays, where flexible working isn't allowed, and of course that can impact disproportionately on certain demographics of the community. Okay. So yeah, I think it's the kind of thing where if we could see more work being done around that area, the actual, what is the template for creating a games studio? Like, what does that look like? And do we have something that we can point to say, we know this works, it may not be the best system in the world, but we know this one works, so if you take that and run with it, you won't be too far off. Feel free to iterate it and improve it from there. But if we could teach at least that, I think that would be a really good thing. And when it comes to why we don't teach it, it's not because the universities wouldn't like to, I'm sure. It's because as an industry, I don't think we've really captured the essence of that ourselves yet.
Thank you.
If I can just add on, what I've found as I've navigated the industry is that I personally have, where possible, looked to work on products that I found interesting, either to me as a player or for audiences that I thought were important. And I've also been very careful to look at the style of game that's being made. So for example, one of the interesting advantages of games as a service is that as opposed to a boxed product that has to be on a shelf on a particular date, games as a service is something that comes out every few weeks. And so actually I found in general there is a lot less likelihood of overtime. And I have found that that is a place where you can actually have a much better work-life balance.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Just for the record, Colin, you mentioned some figures earlier about Fortnite. We found the article, and the figures are as you described about. And also, it doesn't actually state over what period of time. The article doesn't state. So
I'm glad it didn't state one.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask just a couple of follow-up questions on data. We've had evidence during the course of the inquiry from people at universities like Abertay describing the growing interest of universities to analyse particularly the metadata of gameplay, and games companies collect a huge amount of metadata about their users. I'd just be interested to know whether your companies have had experience of working with universities on, or academics from universities on research projects to analyse sort of behaviour of players interacting with different games.
I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, we capture metrics for how our games are used, but it's not something that we've been working directly with a university with it at this time.
I believe we also capture metrics, but it's not something I'm involved in, or not something I can comment on, unfortunately.
I did look into working with Glasgow Caledonian University, have like a gameplay lab where they run like sort of playtesting sessions. It just the timings of kind of what they needed to line up for their coursework and for their students versus what like when I needed that information for like my commercial purposes just didn't quite line up, so it never came around.
So from your experiences, the sort of analysis you do of data generated by gameplay is just used for your own study internally, sort of used for in terms of understanding how you refine and improve the games. Would that be a fair reflection?
Yes.
Yes, as well. And primarily we use it as a signal to show where our game could be improved. So where the player may be having difficulty or where we're not doing something right. So it's really about targeting where design is weakest and where we can improve that.
Yeah, they just echo the same thing. Games are, fundamentally iterative, creative products. So it's just to fit into that process.
So I mean, just for our benefit, for the benefit of the record, so data analysis of gameplay would be used by a games company to look at presumably how long people play for, when and if they lose interest in a game, if there are purchasing decisions built into the game, when they're successful, when they're not successful, that sort of thing. Would that be fair?
Yes, that would be fair.
Yes, that would be fair.
Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. One of the functions of the Select Committee is to make aspects to government, and we touched on earlier finance and tax credits, and so I just wondered whether we could just elaborate a little bit on that. We met Paul Durrant of the UK Games Fund yesterday, and that scheme has got a shelf life at the moment only until the end of March next year, and we're waiting for Brexit permitting the next spending round and to see whether it will be extended or what else might perhaps come in its place that might be an improvement. So really, Tony and Colin, could you just briefly sort of elaborate on what you said earlier on the benefits you've found and other people in the industry have found from that fund that's been going now for 3 years?
Yes, so our current project, we got UK Games Fund support for it last year the previous round. It was £25,000 worth of support, which doesn't sound like a huge amount of money, but as I said, for like a company of our kind of scale, it was really, really useful in terms of helping with our development costs and like really kind of allowing us to make the best game that we could at the time. But aside from the money, we've found that the UK Games Fund has built up like a really fantastic kind of support network in terms of through their, I think they've done 5 or 6 rounds now, and they've done a couple of rounds of like the sort of transfuser program, which is aimed at student teams, and they've been running like a pitch development program as well. And all these companies are kind of connected together and encouraged to meet up at UK Games Fund events, and they put on these events, kind of getting speakers for them, and they're really interesting and useful kind of knowledge sharing as well as the sort of financial backing that you'd had. I think that's really, again, it's really useful for some of the companies. As Colin mentioned, one of the things that the games industry struggles with still as a relatively young industry is how do you make games, and kind of what are best practice and all of these kind of things, and to some degree those things are regarded almost as kind of company secrets and trade secrets that you shouldn't be talking about so much. So to have that sort of support network of people where you can just reach out to them and kind of say like, okay, it's not just about the money, but it's about how do you think is the best way that we can spend this money to give the
So
greatest
there's a catalyst effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And then once you've had that, then you're part of that ecosystem as well. So then you get other. It's a fantastic resource for the country.
Colin.
Yeah, I should probably declare an interest in that. I have been a huge fan of what Paul has been doing with the UK Games Fund for some time, and previously before that, the work that he and his team did as part of Dare to Be Digital at Abertay University. I think the service that the UK Games Fund provides is pivotal in a number of ways. I can give you some examples. Tony's already covered several of them very well, but from my own personal experience, I've seen the fund from a few different directions. So I've not the current business I'm in, but a previous business that I'm involved with has had an award from the Games Fund, which helped the development of that project, which had already had substantial investment internally from the company, but was a project, or is a project, that is about more than entertainment. And when you're trying to work in a very market-led environment, it can be very challenging to find sources of income or sources of funding for something that is trying to push the barrier of what entertainment is. And the UK Games Fund has been particularly good at identifying projects that are trying to do just a little bit more than you might traditionally see within the market and supporting those. So that was one thing I thought they did really well. I've also seen it from the perspective of mentoring, and I've been asked to mentor teams that have been involved in it, and that's been beneficial. I don't think it's just been beneficial for the team that is being mentored. I've learned a whole load from that as well. So as somebody who's been in the industry for a while, having access to a new team who's learning all this for the first time, hearing the questions they ask, the perspectives they have, that becomes a really virtuous cycle as well. And those teams, as Tony alluded to, they become part of your network. So they now have an in to myself. I can refer them to people in my network and so on. So that effect has been incredibly powerful. Just
they'll no doubt be doing their own impact studies to as part of the pitch to try and get the fund renewed or improved. But do you think there's a tangible benefit to the taxpayer in terms of the gap it fills, the continuity it provides for people in the industry? There's a payback to the taxpayer.
Again, I don't have data on that, so I don't want to be making some sort of data-backed claim, but anecdotally, based on my own experience of it, as both a game maker and a taxpayer, yes, I think the effect of it, in my position, understanding where the challenges are within the game development process and the wider commercial implications of that, and then seeing the targeted impact that the UK Games Fund team have had, and understanding the implication of it, yes, I could hand on heart say that is a very effective use of money as a taxpayer.
Okay, I want to go now onto the tax credit scheme. There was a hiatus from when it was conceived by Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, the Dundee tax credit, as it was known, and then when after George Osborne put it on hold and then introduced it, during which, from previous inquiries, we understand quite a lot of people actually went to Canada in particular, which was pitching for pitching.
We've got them back now,
and we've got them back now. So just open it up to the panel from your experience. How important is the video games tax relief to the industry, and also how could it be improved so it's better taken up and by a wider range of companies? So who wants to start?
Yeah, so we've the financial year 2018 was the first year that we've applied for the video games tax credit, and the process. I think the process is pretty straightforward now. I know that the team involved there seem to have done quite a lot of work in terms of kind of getting out there, and they're really they've been almost monthly kind of events around the country at different development hubs, kind of encouraging people to get involved with this. And I think it's one of those things where having the tax credit means that you can look at the finance of a particular title and go, okay, when we're working out the budget of this, we can spend X amount because we know that we're going to get some of that back, and all of that money is essentially getting spent on wages and is keeping people in employment, and then that money is kind of coming back, and it enables you to fill in. I think it was alluded to by one of the panelists earlier. There's kind of you make a game often, and then you've kind of got these few months of
cash flow,
down period while you're waiting for revenue to then kind of come in from different storefront. I mean, it's the same in pretty much any business, right? You don't get the money as soon as the player buys something. That money goes into someone else's pocket, and then 2 months down the line, you invoice them or any of that kind of thing. So having that kind of tax credit and knowing that that tax credit is money that is going to be coming to you at a certain point when you put in your corporate tax return is incredibly useful for being able to sort of bridge that gap and being able to keep a business actually running as a kind of continuous entity.
Yeah, I think I've probably covered it mostly in what I said before, but the tax credit when it came to funding of Earthbound games, which we're doing just now, is obviously a big incentive for investors to put cash in, because it does de-risk for them the potential exposure that they have, and it's definitely it's a reasonable chunk. It's an amount that really does make a difference and changes people's appetite for investment, and the cash flow benefits are, as Tony has covered, is important too. In terms of making it better, I actually think that the HMRC and the trade organisations did a really good job with the environment that they were working at the time. I know there was a lot of concern about the cultural component to the tax breaks, but no, having been involved in that process and understanding all the various aspects that we're trying to balance, I think they actually did a really good job with it. I'm not sure how much easier it could be made under the current legislation restrictions. I think what Tony alluded to with the BFI have been really active in going out there and promoting this and encouraging everybody who possibly can to apply. And I've been present at meetings where they've been doing that. It's great to see. So I actually think it's a sort of shining example of how this sort of thing should be implemented. We
were talking with Paul yesterday about possibly possible benefits of a repayable grant scheme as well to fill other gaps. So, but let me just move on. So this is not just a men only. And two final questions. One to Keely, from Canada, which was the big competitor when we last looked before the tax credit was put in place. What does Canada do anything that we don't do that we can learn from?
So it's interesting. Speaking about the tax credits, I believe in Canada they're handled at a provincial level, and what I observed was an interesting effect, which was that one province would increase the tax credit and the companies would move there, and then another province would do so and the companies would move there, and actually in many cases it was the same staff having to move all over the country. I have lived in a variety of provinces and have enjoyed it very much, but it is an important thing to consider, you know, how these things are applied. I find it quite interesting because I actually find that what goes on in the games industry here is actually quite similar. It's quite transferable, and I think that's one thing to keep in mind. I think that Tamia alluded to this earlier, which is that we're working on things that are digital. These aren't tied to physical resources, and all of these companies are quite mobile. And so, you know, when looking at things like tax credits and regulation, it's really important to be thoughtful about the implications that it'll have locally.
Raised an interesting about the importance of a level playing field within the United Kingdom, so, which sort of destabilising competition between jurisdictions wouldn't necessarily be a good thing.
Assuming you want that.
Okay, and just final question, Tamia. Before you came here, you presumably looked all around Europe as to where to go. Are there any interesting lessons from different countries, possibly in Eastern Europe or elsewhere, that we could learn from in terms of the game industry?
Well, I was very young when I made this decision, so I wasn't necessarily thinking about tax credits and the implications.
But just in terms of things that people do in the industry.
Yes, well, I mean, you know, there were a lot of factors that kind of narrowed my search, one of which was that my strongest foreign language was English. So, you know, that's obviously a big pulling factor here, that a lot of people learn English as their kind of second main language. And also just you know, especially at the time, to me, it seemed like the UK had like the most kind of vibrant and welcoming games community and games industry out of the options, that I considered. And I was mostly just focused on Europe rather than going overseas. But yeah, I think it was a big factor was the community that I think comes up over and over in people's answers, and the fact that it's such a tight-knit community and that people know each other, and there's a lot of that kind of that peer-to-peer support and kind of helping each other learn and grow and kind of find your footing. So yeah, I'm not sure if I can speak to necessarily research other.
Just in case anything occurred to you.
No,
okay.
of course.
Ian Lucas.
Is there a downside to the free-to-play model as far as any of you are concerned?
There can be, yes.
What would that be?
There is the potential for incentivizing player behaviors in ways that would be considered unhealthy. And we've seen some reporting on that recently with I think the loot boxing phenomenon is something you've undoubtedly heard about.
Yeah.
And that's an example of something that can happen if there isn't clear guidance or expectation as to what is acceptable and what is not. So
how do you devise a policy within your business of what is acceptable as far as that is concerned?
Well, personally, I've tried to take an ethical and moral approach to business wherever I possibly can throughout my career, and so that would be no different in that situation. I go by the rule, the golden rule. It's like I wouldn't want somebody to monetize me in that way in a game, and likewise I wouldn't expect to do that to someone else. But I understand not everybody feels like that.
Tony, you set up your own business in 2015. Had you previously, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And you previously had worked for Rockstar, you worked for other businesses.
That's
so
right.
Was that the first time you'd run your own business?
I'd been self-employed for like a year, a couple of years previous to that, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk a bit about money. And I ran my own business at one point, which was completely different to the type of business you're running. But obviously, we've talked a little bit about income. And the figures that you've mentioned seem incredibly low to me in terms of income. I don't think anybody's talked about anything over $100 or £100 at any stage. So when you're running your own business, how do you make money?
Do
you use the free to use model?
No. So in Ant Workshop in my company, we do premium products, but that's
you pay up front.
So that's essentially someone pays an amount of money and then they get a game, and that's that. But it was very much, for me, was a consideration of scale and what I could actually kind of do. I mean, as I said, the company was set up just myself, so it had to be, okay, what can I do?
So do you have a product on the market at the moment, a game?
Yeah, so we've got a few different things that we've released.
So can you give me an idea of how much a game would cost?
So
one of your games, anyone?
So typically our things, you'd be looking at somewhere around £10.
£10. So you want to sell a lot of games in that case, don't you?
Yes. Yeah, that would be nice.
So and you want to sell them worldwide, presumably?
Yes.
With a benefit, and these are all sold online.
That's right.
And so, what are the best markets for games? Which countries in the world? For your games?
So we've found that the majority of our stuff sells in Europe and in North America. We also sell in the Australian markets, but they haven't done so well for us. But a lot of these things kind of just go through the storefronts. So, for example, there are a number of digital storefronts, like PlayStation, the Xbox. On PC, there's Steam is like the kind of the main one, and largely you're just selling through them to whichever markets they support.
So how many editions, or how many of your most successful games have you sold? In other words, what's the most successful? What sort of number are we talking about for you, just roughly?
I think the most successful thing that we've released, we've sold somewhere around, probably around 50,000 copies.
I'm just working out my maths and stuff. So scale is really important.
Yeah, I mean, so what's important for us as a company has been scale of portfolio. So rather than an individual type, like, so if you are only making one game every 5 years or something like that, or like, so say a company like Rockstar where they're releasing one game every 5 years or something like that, you need to sell a lot of copies of that one game. But because we're spending less time making an individual title, and in particular, we've been helping other people to release their titles as well. So building out that sort of broader catalogue of releases has been particularly sort of useful for us.
Do you do any free-to-play games?
We do actually have one free game that you can download that's entirely ad-supported, so there's no in-app purchases in that whatsoever.
So you can't actually buy any additional.
No, it's just
aspects.
if you want the
so
income
what's
that we
the
get.
business motivation for you for that?
So the idea behind that title was if we can get enough. It was very much a novelty title. It took us 1 month to develop. It was if we can get enough people to download this Scottish-themed novelty title, potentially we can make enough ad revenue off of it that it would kind of support itself.
So how would you get any revenue from it?
Well, so like I said, the revenue that we get is through advertising on it. So at certain points in the game, it will pop up an advert, and if the player downloads the title that's linked to, we get a cut of that advertising. Yeah.
Okay. So, Keely, I've just got a blog in front of me from Outplay, which is called An Introduction to Mobile Monetization, and it's headed, first line in it, AKA How to Make Money in a Crazily Competitive Business. And do you know the blog? Have you read it?
No, I haven't read that one.
Okay, but it's basically about it's about how to monetize the product, and we come across this obviously in areas like music as well, where it's a challenge for artists to monetize their product. So, Colin's mentioned the issues relating to ethics. And one of the lines in it talks about designing fun and endless compulsion loops. And it says that's a key element of any successful mobile free-to-play game. In that context, what does the compulsion mean? You design. Do you take into account compulsion when you design part of the game?
So as a designer, my main focus is on creating a fun and engaging experience. So I think about motivation, and I think about what our players would enjoy.
So you don't think about compulsion? This is the blog's word, not my word. And it's on your company's blog.
So I can only speak to Crafty Candy, which is the game that I'm the lead designer for. And we have in that game a variety of levels where you play a match 3 puzzle game. It's similar to playing Sudoku or a crossword or something of that size. And you go in and you have 5 lives. So you have 5 tries, and if you succeed, you're able to go on to the next level. And if you look at that, that does create a loop. You have a level that you complete, and if you do so successfully, you're able to move on to the next one. And you'll find in game design, those loops are frequently referred to.
So are there people within your business who focus on monetization of the product?
We don't have anyone that exclusively looks at monetization.
Because, I mean, none of you are going to be in business. The reason this is a successful business. It makes money and it's providing jobs. And we've seen that. It's hugely impressive to see the way that Dundee has benefited because of this. But it does depend on making money. And what we want to try and get to is talking about money with games companies, because you don't seem to want to talk about it, not just today, actually, but in general terms. And because it's a worldwide business, there's a lot of money being made. But we find it very difficult to get to the bottom of the amount of money that's being made and how it is made. And we'd really like the businesses to be, I think, more open in the way that they make money. I mean, do you recognise that at all? Does that sound fair to you?
I certainly recognise that, yeah. I mean, it's, I think it's quite a challenge for a lot of games businesses to talk about. Just to be clear, I'm talking personally here. I'm not talking Earthbound. I'm using my experience that I've developed over a long period of time in the industry. And I certainly recognise it. I think one of the biggest challenges is that there are actually a lot of games companies who are not making money. Mm. And in those circumstances, it can be incredibly challenging to speak about the amount of money that you're making, because it throws up all sorts of additional questions, such as, well, you know, what is the sustainability of this business, and so on. So I think that can be a real challenge, and particularly for smaller businesses as well, because we work in a hits-driven industry, and as with any hit-driven industry, where you have this skewing towards the most successful products, where you look at the high-level figures of how much this industry is making, and you go, oh, it's making billions of pounds, and you say, well, that must mean the average company is making this much money, and it's absolutely not true. The top 5 or 10 products are making by far the lion's share of that, and then the rest of it is distributed piecemeal amongst what remains. So I think part of the issue that you're facing may be that the people, I don't know who you've spoken to, but maybe the people you're speaking to are people who haven't had the experience in those areas, and that you need to speak to. I mean, just look at the top 10. Go speak to those people. They're the people who'll be able to give you the kind of answers that I think you're seeking. Is that reasonable?
That's helpful, yes.
I also wanted to add, I think, this might be controversial, but I think there's an aspect of the games industry where I don't think a lot of people get into it for money. I think there's a real sort of, we're doing it for the art, or we're doing it for the greater, you know, whatever. There's a lot of that mentality. And those loops that were discussed earlier, you know, there's this omnipresent concept in game development and the wider psychology called flow, which is, you know, something that most game designers achieve, are hoping to achieve, which is to kind of keep you in this perfect state of, you know, always just challenging you, but not too much so that you feel out of your depth. And that kind of psychological state is something that, you know, is very relevant for video games. But the sort of concept behind it is play. You know, play is at the core of video games, and play is also at the core of human learning. And so there's a lot of, you know, interesting states that maybe are not fully explored and understood, where, you know, games are impactful because of the player agency and because of this state of, you know, highly switched on mental state. But equally, that same flow state, I think, can be present and utilized or exploited within the creative community as well, where a lot of people will want to create for the sake of creation, and they're not necessarily focused on the money. They're not necessarily wanting to talk about the money because you know, a lot of skills, as we discussed earlier, are very transferable, and people could move into other technological industries and make more money, but there is something about the games industry that keeps them here, which is not about the money. So I think there's, I don't necessarily have an answer, but there is something there, I think, in the games industry. And I sometimes hate this word, but it's a very passionate industry. It's a very passion-driven community, and that can serve it and hurt it in a lot of different ways. But I think maybe there's not such an easy route for you to get to your answer, because that is maybe not a lot of people's top priority, or it's not their motivation, and therefore it's, it kind of gets muddied up on the way, because there's lots of elements feeding into the well-being of developers and the reason we create.
So to go from what Timmy just said there about, the reason that pretty much all the people that I know in games got into games is because they love games and they want to make something that people really enjoy playing. So when you're talking about compulsion, I want my games to be compelling. I want people to play my game and kind of think they finish a level and then they want to play the next level, in the same way that an author would write a book and want people to, you finish a chapter and it's like, oh, I'm not going to go to bed now, I'm going to read this next chapter, or the way that millions of people waited for the next Avengers film or the next episode of Game of Thrones, or would sit up and watch a whole box set of the new favourite TV show dropping on Netflix. It's a creative thing that it's like you want people to love what you're making, and I don't think that there's anything inherently kind of dirty or wrong about that. It's an artistic, it's an artistic drive.
Thank you. Can I just ask Tim one more question about coming to Scotland? When you first came to Scotland, you made the choice to come to Abertay, which seems to work very well for you and many other people we've met. Did the cost of the degree make any difference to you coming to Scotland?
It did, in the sense that the wonderful Scottish government paid for my education because I'm an EU citizen.
So you could have gone to England, but it would have cost a lot more, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Or Wales as well.
Yes, it's true. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just one follow-up question from me. Keely, I just wanted to ask about, just on Crafty Candy, just a question we've asked other game companies as well. I know there's a Facebook login feature to play the game. What sort of data sharing arrangement do you have with Facebook? Is some data about gameplay shared with Facebook as part of the login feature?
I actually don't know what information is shared with Facebook. Sorry.
Would it be possible for us to follow up in writing on that? What we'd just like to confirm is, as part of the login arrangement, what data is shared between the companies, and also what information is shared with the user about the fact this will take place.
Yes, I can request that information.
Clive Efford.
Are games that you create capable of causing harm?
That's a really difficult question for me to answer, and the reason for that is because I can imagine situations where you can take anything to extreme and cause harm with something. So, I can imagine how you can take that glass of water and cause harm with it. It's not. I understand what you're getting at. So, in the context of what you're saying, no, I don't believe that's the case.
Anybody else thoughts in?
I agree with Colin that I think you can take anything and you can make it harmful. I strongly believe that because games are an interactive medium, and because of the way that we engage with them, and they're a lot more active rather than TV or movies or whatever that are a bit more passive. They're kind of colloquially referred to as like lean back entertainment because you're not engaged, whereas games are lean forward entertainment because you're fully engaged. And therefore I do think that they can have a real impact on the way we perceive the world and the way we interact with the world.
So are people capable of becoming addicted to playing the games?
I think people are capable of being addicted to anything, you know, and I think it's, I think there's a pattern of the games industry being brought back to this question of whether games have all these various negative psychological impacts, and a lot of them have been scientifically disproven in the past, but I don't think it's, I think the games industry absolutely has a responsibility in that, but I don't think it's the sole party to look at. For example, a lot of, and I think, yeah, actually I'll come back to a point that I alluded to earlier, which was a wider understanding and appreciation of games as a medium as a whole by wider community. A lot of games are still viewed as children's toys, even though a lot of video games are rated 18+. And a lot of, if you go into a game shop, a physical game shop as much as they're on the decline, you will see adults, parents, purchasing 18+ rated games for their 12-year-old kids. I've seen it happen. I know lots of people who buy these games for their kids. And they don't respect the medium enough to see it as a text worth studying and going through with their kids. You know, if you decide that that's something appropriate for your underage kid, fair game, you know, it's your choice. But then I feel like you should give it the respect that you can study it together and talk about how it reflects culture and how it impacts their psyche, and, you know, have a wider discussion the same way as you would about a film or about a book. But games are still stuck at this level of being seen as toys, and they're not. They're so much more than that. And so there's a lot of parental responsibility in understanding this and understanding its impact and talking with your kids about the, you know, about the media they consume, and not sort of, you know, if you don't recognize it as something that can have a powerful impact on you or your, you know, the way you see the world, and then you kind of are surprised when it is, you know, it changes the way you see the world or it changes the way you interact with the world. I feel like there's a disconnect where you can't act surprised if you didn't give it the respect, or like at least you then have to go back and reevaluate how you see it as a cultural product. And I think that that's actually, for me personally, the biggest disconnect, in that people don't take it seriously enough to look into how they consume it and how it affects their relationship with the real world. Because, you know, just as any art form or just as any cultural output, games, you know, very much take the real world and reflect it like a distorted mirror in a way, you know, sometimes satirizing it, sometimes realistic, sometimes totally outlandish, but then it feeds right back into culture. And I don't think that's sort of recognized by a lot of people. And I think it also kind of comes back to when we talk about, you know, what would be the downside of the games industry not diversifying or not achieving some of these goals. And it is that it's not only that we'll have, you know, more boring games or less revenue or whatever, it's that there is this cultural vein connecting games as such an active and engaging and player agent driven medium right back at culture and society. So I wish there was more respect for it in that way, because I think the games industry is very good at self-regulating and very good at sort of evolving practices and, you know, ways to kind of, you know, like, I don't think any games industry is fundamentally like trying to make kids addicted or anything like that. So I feel like the other side of society kind of has to step up.
Well, so how do I, as somebody who's got to, you know, legislate, and you know, when there are harms, how do I satisfy myself that the industry is doing all it can to protect those vulnerable people who may be prone to overplaying or be unduly influenced by things that they experience in the games? How do I protect against that?
Well, for once, we have rating boards and ratings that are, you know, globally enforced and accepted. There's multiple rating bodies, but they are there. They're just often ignored by the consumer. So I think that at some point, you know, there has to be responsibility on both sides. Like if the games are going through certification and they're, you know, rated a certain.
So what about controlling the length of play, the length of time that somebody would play a game? Do you ever introduce anything into your games that would
I
suggest
actually know
that?
plenty of games that do. I can't necessarily speak to like, you know, every game or whatever, but like lots of platforms actually have, like, especially Nintendo, I think are pretty good at that. Like, you know, platforms will kind of regularly.
So do you all do it? Do you have programs that you know, remind people how long they've been playing?
So for example, Crafty Candy is a mobile game, and we offer it on different operating systems from Apple and on Android. And at the moment, Apple has their screen time controls, and you're able to see where you spent your time on which games, and you can actually set limits within that. And I believe Android also has a digital well-being controls available on their platform.
Right. And the data that you collect, do you use it in any way to identify people or patterns of play that may be when people are playing too long, or other forms of harm that may result? Do you use the data in that way?
I'm not aware of us doing that.
Right. But I mean, theoretically, is that possible? Because you do collect a lot of data as people play. I mean, for instance, could you, if you had an age limit, could you identify where, from the pattern of play, that this is a child that's playing, not an adult? Is that not possible?
I don't. I mean, I'm not a data scientist, but I don't know how you would accurately kind of say, okay.
So how do you enforce a minimum age requirement then, apart from just, you know, parental controls? What else can be done?
It's on the box. I don't know how much simpler we can make it, honestly. Like, you know, it's on our box the way it would be on a movie.
Right.
Then it's consumer responsibility, in my opinion.
So can I just go back and ask about these compulsion loops that were referred to? I mean, I think it was your company's article. How do you set about to create a compulsion loop? What goes into it?
So a loop, a core loop, is frequently something along the lines of do something, get something, invest in something. That's seen in a lot of games. I, in my day-to-day, am more frequently designing features and looking at content. The core loop is something that's usually set early on in a game.
Right. But I mean, the word compulsion suggests that we're trying to encourage people to do something that they might not otherwise do. I mean, is that the aim? Is that what a compulsion loop is, to get people to engage and spend extra money on additions within the game?
I think it would be worth taking a step back at this point, because one of the issues that we have at what would you call it, a commercial level within digital media as a whole, is the business model for it essentially incentivizes businesses to capture the maximum amount of attention in people. That is, and that's not just games. That's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's YouTube, it's Google, it's everyone. So the finite resource, you know, when you move into a digital world and you have limitless distribution, etc., the limited resource that remains is attention. And if there is a direct relationship between the amount of time that people spend in an application, be that a game or something else, and the rate at which they will monetize, then you don't have to be Adam Smith to figure out that that is going to incentivize the behavior within companies to create products that do that sort of thing. Now, what I would suggest is that a role that government and legislators may be able to take is to provide mitigation for that. So if you look, for example, I've looked quite extensively at the history of the broadcast industry. And if you look at the history of the broadcast industry, they had a lot of similar challenges to what we now see within the digital industry as well. So the UK, back almost 100 years ago, took the decision to set up the BBC as a model for which they could focus the attention on the quality and public service of the utility that was being built in a way that prevented the run ahead into what essentially happened in the American market, where advertising and attention grabbing became the predominant method of monetization. So we actually have quite a good example in our cultural history within the UK of how this issue has occurred in the past in other media, how it's been addressed, and what the implications of that are.
So you provide free access to games online, and so can I just take the question about enforcing age limits? How do you do that because Timmy has said about the ages on the box, but it's a different situation when you're online. How do you enforce it online?
It's handled by the store that you sell through. So the digital stores that you sell through are responsible for the user.
On what sort of checks?
We don't have that information.
And what sort of checks are there at that stage?
I wouldn't be able to comment. You'd have to speak to somebody who runs a platform for that.
Right. Okay. And can I just one other question? We've been having a debate as to whether the gaming industry is art, and for instance, film is quite often given funding through arts and cultural funding, say from the lottery. Should games be treated the same as films in that regard?
Yes.
Why?
I think they should because they are an art form. So in not in Scotland but in England, there is Creative England, which funds or which offers I think it's loans and has various different pots of funding for games amongst other art forms. In Scotland, Creative Scotland doesn't have that same kind of thing. The games industry is absolutely a up and coming creative industry, and I've in the almost 20 years that I've been in the games industry, I've not heard a compelling argument for why games aren't art, to be honest.
Right. So isn't the So are you saying that there is a creative industry out there in the games industry that just creates games for the sake of games, for the sake of the art, and not to make money?
Yes, there's absolutely people that do that.
Right. And so that if that's going to continue, that requires some sort of so funding. So for instance, I mean, the lottery is not really a source of funding for example, for startup businesses. Generally, it's used to support arts and cultural things that might not otherwise take place because that funding is not available. Otherwise, funding wouldn't be available. Is that so? That you're saying that that's true about gaming as well? And how would you be sure that you're not that we're not using arts and cultural funding for something that should be covered by a business grant or an education grant of some sort?
So I'm not sure exactly how you would ensure that kind of thing. But what I will say is, and to go back to the earlier points about diversity and that kind of thing, there are a huge number of game makers in the UK that have massively underrepresented voices. And part of the reason for this is because the types of experience and the types of games that they want to make and that speak to their lives aren't commercially viable. They're not the sort of thing that you can put an in-app purchase in. They're not the sort of thing like for like Fortnite where you could have a character that does a funny dance, and you could sell that to people. And because these things aren't commercially viable, and these people would have to be in a very privileged position to be able to spend their own time and efforts making something, knowing that there was, like, that they weren't ever going to get any kind of recompense for that.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. I think just to be clear for the record, when Clive said we're having a debate about whether games are art, I think it was Clive's having a debate about it. Paul Farrelly.
I've just got one. Video games must be art as well as design, otherwise they wouldn't be in the V&A in London and Dundee. So, Clive. Just a final question. We had a really great session yesterday with, I've seen so many companies, with Chris van der Kuhl of 4J Studios about ethics and the industry. And it was a completely different tone from the questioning session we had with JGEX, in particular when we cited the instance of a young man who'd got into, was only addicted to the game, but got into debt in the thousands and thousands of pounds that he'd spent. And during that session, we learned that the company had a limit, which seemed quite a high limit on spending, £5,000 a month, I think. But that was, it admitted, was mainly due to fraud considerations and not well-being. And amoral or immoral is something, a word you could probably apply from our investigations to how Facebook maximises its profit. Probably not to the people in this industry, but one thing that did come out of the session was there was an indifference, really, which maybe that's not the right word, but the attitude was, this is not our problem, it's society's problem, which was kind of shocking, really. And we'll be looking at addiction, the need for more research into addiction, what role the industry can play without stifling the industry or covering it with red tape. What are the externalities of gaming, as economists might call them? And I just wondered whether the panel thought, again, being proportionate and not wanting to wrap a creative, vibrant industry up in red tape, whether there is a role for legislators or government, if not just putting down legislation, but encouraging an industry to adopt best practice, voluntary code, self-regulation, and whether there is a possible role for government in that respect. If I can just go along the panel, Colin.
Of course, there is exactly that, and one of the things that I'm very aware of and have discussed many times before is that first and foremost, we as a society need to understand what we expect our digital interactive media to deliver, what that environment is that we're trying to create. And if we are left in a completely commercial environment where you can see a race to the bottom in all sorts of ways, where content becomes more shocking in order to get more attention and draw eyeballs towards it, you retain players as long as you possibly can, etc. All of these things, these are definitely things that as a society we should be discussing, and as legislators we should be taking a view towards at least indicating best practice and setting some sense of what is reasonable and proportionate. Now, obviously, our trade bodies are doing those sort of things as well, and many people within our industry are already saying that, including myself, and there's that aspect to it. But I think it would be useful as a nation to have that kind of debate at that level, to say, what is it that we expect? And I think it's most important here that we don't single games out as some special case, because I always think that the temptation is to put games into its own silo as something special, but I don't see it as that way at all. When I look at the games industry, what I see is the games industry is part of a spectrum of media that is that has all sorts of things. It covers arts, humanities, entertainment, politics, research, all sorts of areas. And what we're seeing in the games industry is digital media touching that industry and disrupting it. What we're not seeing yet is the full picture, because we're only beginning to see that happening now in other areas such as social media, so communications and arts, humanities, etc. Those areas, there's a huge disparity between the amount of investment that has gone into the area of entertainment, because it is market-driven, market-led, and there's an audience for it, compared to all these other areas. That's the area where I think that at a governmental level we can really affect the conversation to say, yes, clearly the market is working more or less in this area. How can we take these other areas and bring them up to that level rather than trying to squeeze things down? So, and as I've said before, I think we have precedents in our history, because I think the obvious parallel is with broadcast, because when you look at broadcasting and the disruption that caused at the time that it came in, obviously the ability to be able to communicate suddenly across an entire population had huge ramifications for politics, for education, entertainment, and so on. And I really think we should be looking at that for guidance for what we're doing next, as our next step.
Keely?
I don't have anything further to add.
Okay. Tony, you must have something further to add.
Well, why do you think that?
I don't know.
I'm not a psychologist, so I couldn't say for sure are games addictive or not. I don't know. That's not in my wheelhouse to say. I know that there is certainly research that sits in both camps on that, and obviously you as a committee have talked to games companies that are making a lot of money off of games and off of people playing games a long time. On the other hand, there are people who are making money from selling games rehab courses and that kind of thing. So I think that there are a lot of people with a lot of kind of stakes involved in this, and from my point of view, I think it would be really good if the government's sort of initial kind of steps into this were to fund research on it, and really kind of get involved, and let's look at some more answers, because as I think has been brought up before, that if games companies are funding the research, then one camp will always say, well, they funded that research, and vice versa, and it's like, okay, let's have someone that's fully independent and do like a full kind of look into it.
Taken evidence on that. So, Tamir, finally.
I agree. I think research would be very important, and just general sort of incentivizing companies to gather information and then share it, or in some way kind of, continue the dialogue kind of more publicly amongst game studios as well, not just internally. Something that I think had an actually pretty positive effect is the gender pay gap reporting requirement. I think that actually helped a lot of games companies to actually face the reality of their numbers, and even if before that they would kind of anecdotally believe that there's an issue and they would kind of pay it lip service that it's something that they're working on, I think actually seeing the numbers was like a wake-up call for a lot of companies to go, okay, hang on, like this is more than just a conceptual, somewhere problem in the back of our heads, and this is something that we can actually do something about, and let's sit down and think about what that is. So I think kind of these little nudges to kind of, drive out the information and then inspire companies for action are a really good example of what government can do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that concludes the questions from the committee this morning. We're very grateful for your evidence. And just to comment on Colin's sort of answer there towards the end, I think we all absolutely agree that these are issues that affect a broad range of different sorts of digital media. And although we've focused on games today, we have other sessions coming up with the social media companies and other technology companies as well, because I think these are issues that affect the gathering of data. The battle for eyeballs is something that affects the whole of digital media and is something we are very interested in. Thank you very much.